Hello, Geoff here from the University of Canberra, and I'm here with Michelle Grattan to talk about the week in politics. Hello, Michelle.
Hi, Geoff.
So we've had big news this week all about water. So the government's additional measures to help those impacted by the drought. Now in the package, we've seen that there's a new scheme for concessional loans for businesses in those drought-affected areas. So who will this benefit, and is it enough to make a difference?
This will benefit businesses that have a connection with agriculture, like machinery dealers, stock and station agents, and similar businesses. It won't benefit the local hairdresser in a town or the fish and chip shop. So some businesses will undoubtedly feel, well, we're affected by the drought too, and they'll be a bit feeling discriminated against. But in practical terms, I think that it's sensible to restrict such aid. After all, the government can't really save everyone in every situation. As to whether the whole package will be enough, well, that really depends on whether the drought continues on. If it does continue well into next year, the government's made it pretty clear that we'll get additional measures. But for the meantime, I think that this should satisfy the demands for action. It's a pretty far-reaching package. It includes not only the new loan scheme for businesses, but also improved conditions for the loan scheme that exists already for farmers, those concessional loans. It includes more money for local councils, for road works, even aid to schools in drought-affected areas that are finding their enrolments down. So there's quite a lot in it.
So we certainly hope that the weather breaks for the farming communities as well.
We also should mention another aspect of the package, which was a little unexpected. There's a water allocation in it for farmers to grow fodder for stock. Only that, they can't use it for other purposes, but I think that too will be particularly welcome, because there's been a bit of general talk about, well, why can't a bit of water be found somehow to meet this emergency situation?
So in general, is the government meeting public expectations of what would be expected as a response to a severe drought?
I think it will be seen as meeting the need immediately. And what's interesting in this whole drought debate is that the expectations are not just in the regional areas, the drought-affected areas, but they're also in the metropolitan areas. And MPs, government MPs, have reported back from the cities saying people there, voters, are really concerned about what's happening in the country, and I think that message at a political level has got through quite strongly to Scott Morrison.
So turning to the other side of politics now, so we've seen that the ALP's election post-mortem has been released, and it says that Labor lost the election because of a weak strategy that couldn't adapt to the arrival of Scott Morrison. And it had a cluttered agenda around policies and an unpopular leader. So have the reviewers, that is the South Australian former Premier Jay Weatherill and former Federal Minister Craig Emerson, have they nailed the problem?
I think they have. It's not an unexpected conclusion, of course. I think most people who've been commenting on the election result, looking with hindsight, we didn't see it coming, most of us, but with a backward glance, it was pretty obvious what went wrong. Having said that, I think this report does add valuable insight. It goes into detail about campaigning. It's interesting that the ALP, which previously had been seen as very strong in its on-the-ground campaigning and its communications campaigning, this time fell short. The Liberals had learnt their lesson from the past election, and they'd caught up and passed Labor in that regard. But on the overall campaign, I think that with a look backwards, the big agenda was just too big for the public to swallow, and particularly the outer suburban voters that Labor hoped to attract by spending up on education, health, pensioner, dental care, a whole lot of programs, came to think, really, can this be afforded? Can we, isn't this all a bit rash and risky? And they pulled back and turned away from Labor.
Are such reviews quite useful or not in terms of having a balanced view of what would have gone wrong, or do they just spark more concern and angst amongst people?
Well, they certainly spark a bit of bad publicity, and you see this in the media today, of course, and there is inevitably some angst. Of course, a lot of attention has been on Bill Shorten. The review doesn't pull punches, it acknowledges his unpopularity, but it also stresses that this was only one factor. No single factor cost Labor this election. It was a whole range of things. It was interesting that Bill Shorten yesterday put out a statement just before the review was made public, saying that if reruns were allowed, he'd do a few things differently, including having a different position on the franking credits policy, which of course caused great controversy in the election. He also made the point in the statement that he was going to be around a long time, so a few people noted that.
So Labor is still left with the task of recasting those policies. So how tough is this going to be for them?
I think it's going to be very tough because it's under a lot of pressure, more pressure usually than oppositions find themselves under in the media, and it will be pressed on what it wants to do on this or that area, what policy it's going to drop, how it's going to revise its tax agenda. The whole climate issue is difficult for it, and it'll face demands for answers to these questions earlier than it wants to give those answers. It would be foolish to rush its policy reviews because some policies are more appropriately crafted quite soon before an election. They've got to have enough time to be sold, but nevertheless they can look out of date if they're done too early. On the other hand, of course, everyone's saying do it now. So it's going to be a difficult period for Labor. It's going to be very testing for Anthony Albanese. One of the problems, and this is highlighted by the review, is juggling the two main constituencies that Labor has: the suburban, traditional working class people and the progressives in the inner city areas. Labor got a swing from progressive voters in those areas, but lost votes in the suburban working class areas. But getting that right is very difficult. Maybe these constituencies can never be really reconciled, but you've got to find a better way to deal with them if Labor is going to be successful.
Thank you very much, Michelle.
Thanks, Geoff.